absolutely my privilege to be able to introduce Gail Simon, who is, for those of you who don't know, is a systemic therapist and methodologist. And this book was a result of many years of writing about practice. And she's going to kick us off for the event. Gail?
Thank you, Naz. And thank you all for making time coming along this evening. It is humbling. It is a bit scary. But it's also, there's something very strange about creating a book and then convening a launch. And in a way, it kind of creates a community. Just seeing so many people together reminds me that despite these isolationing times, we are part of something much bigger. And that's really encouraging. So that's tempering some of my anxiety right at this moment, performance anxiety. Actually, aside from answering any questions people might have towards the end of this session, my contribution this evening is to read something. I'm going to read something from the book. It's the first piece in the book. And there's so many different kinds of writing. Sometimes when I've been writing a paper for a journal or a chapter or something like that, or indeed for my own doctorate or other programs I've taken over time, it's been really hard work, going over and over each sentence, finding the right words, the right order for the words, to make sure that I was saying what I wanted to say or needed to be said, and to weave things in the right kind of way. That, yeah. But this, the thing that I'm going to read now, wasn't like that. It wasn't of that ilk. It was just something that kind of happened. It just happened. So I'm going to bring it up on my screen and read it to you. It's called Indigenous and Other Ways. And in brackets, it's called Denkzettel. And there's an introduction in the book to why the term Denkzettel is used. But this is Indigenous and Other Ways. People sometimes think that indigenous refers to being, to biology, to inherent knowledges, and not to the more fluid practices of becoming, looking after that which is precious, historical, vulnerable to eradication. Many things come to mind. Firstly, when people ask me what being Jewish means to me, 1,000 images, 1,000 feelings flash before my eyes, mostly untellable, unsayable, uncommunicable, all an imagined, or all positioning me an imagined left or right of the asker. In my mind's eye, I'm holding the small, square, black and white photo, grayscale actually, of Edith Klajko, my mother's cousin, and her daughter Feishin, aged 5, standing between her mother and her mother's boyfriend, all holding hands for the photographer on a wide, wide street in Riga, 1938. I see the Negev. I've never been there. I can't go. And stories of places, people, sites, tribes and tribalism, turning points that made their way into history, creating narrative foundation stones for education, for survival, and ways of knowing, long since critiqued by me and others, many others, too numerous to honour in this moment, this nanosecond of an unfolding life beyond my body or yours. I see a moment in Swiss Cottage Library when, in the psychoanalytic section, my hand reached up and took down the biography of the real Anna O, Berta Pappenheim. When I realised who she was, who she really was, I sat down on the library bench, read till the library shut, amazed, shocked, angry, relieved to realize that Anna O, the famous case study, was a work of fiction, that the description of her said more about the describers than she who was being described. Storytellers, biographers for theory, resembling nothing of a life lived ethically, proudly, courageously, knowingly. This woman is where I like to think I come from, whom I have followed. She was a pioneer, a social worker, a thorn in the side, a truth teller. She spoke out at conferences. She did not lie. She told problematic truths as theatre, as poetry, even as prayer. She told the male Jewish authorities the fucking truth about white slavery, about the abduction of poor white women, of poor white Jewish women, and the men were scared of what was happening around them in the community, the threat of Nazis trafficking Jews to their deaths. Yet bold and brave and in their face, she, Berta Pappenheim, for this name needs saying as often as we can to douse the fictionalized Anna O, those professional theories that live on to keep other women down. She, Berta Pappenheim, pointed to, evidenced the oppression of women, of communities. She pointed to lies told, to the systems that supported them. She pointed to the men whom she was addressing, whom behind her back said, back to the doctor, back to Breuer, to Freud, to whoever will get her and her uppity friends out of our hair. We have a job to do. Well, the Holocaust came and went anyway, despite their best efforts. And I'm here speaking my truths because some of my family didn't die then. They didn't perish then. Not all of them anyway. They tried to get away. They tried every which way. In fact, the 11th hour came and went, and they did get out, just. And how did they get out? Because Tante Lulu, a family friend who got out earlier from Berlin to Bradford, from a city built on sand to a city built on millstone grit, cities I know well in this life, because Tante Lulu wrote letters. She wrote letters. She wrote letters at regular intervals to the Jewish Board of Deputies. She wrote the facts. She emphasized the time frame. She kept writing, and after several months, time dangerously spent, my mother, aged 11, her 13-year-old brother, and my grandparents came to Bradford to run a hostel for unaccompanied minors, refugees, teenagers who had said goodbye to their parents and grandparents and siblings too, and knowing deep down it may be forever, for many it was. In a folded 1960s newspaper cutting that I read last year, a Telegraph and Argus interview, Jewish Chronicle maybe, with Tante Lulu, she casually reported she trained as a young woman in social work with Berta Pappenheim. Tante Lulu trained with Berta Pappenheim. My family was saved by the learning of women that persistence is what you do. You never give up. You don't hide your Jewishness. You don't hide your humanity. You don't sidestep your commitment. This I learned, and maybe already knew. Indigenous knowing is not about biology. It's not about history. Or it is about history or herstory. It's about learning from those who walked the walk, who trod paths, sometimes in one direction only, sometimes not even walked, taken there, out of sight, disappeared. We know those facts, those figures, but what did they know that we choose to forget? What did they hope we would remember and act on? They believe in us, the children across the world, they, the people of all genders, in whatever countries, they whose languages have been eradicated, whose tongues cut out, whose bodies assaulted, whose lives terminated, secretly, publicly. Indigenous knowledge is not just about knowing, it's not just about surviving. It's about living with a critical awareness of what's gone before, what is going on, what will happen. And we act because of our Indigenous knowing. We try to prevent because of our Indigenous knowing. This knowing is not in our genes, it's in our conscience, in our courage, not to protect old ways or restricted customs, but human rights, safety, freedoms, possibilities, to right power imbalances, to correct unfairness, to challenge stereotypes and laws created to constrain and restrain the best of human energies. Indigenous knowing is not about creating silos for population groups. Blood flows, it runs wild through and beyond the contours of human life into confluences of great, majestic even, scary rivers, the small feeding into the large, shaping the landscape, cutting it into left and right banks, and the confusion of tribalized territories. The essence of ourselves, our tributaries, made us so, separated us with the land. And the short-term history eats our long-term memory. So when we're told to count the grain in our backyard, sometimes we count. And when we're taught to sharpen the tips of our weapons, sometimes we reach for our knives. Someone here asks, who are we, Paleface? And they are right to ask. They are right to challenge the lumped togetherness of all. And yet, are we not also an all, a collective, with responsibility for each other? Naz.
Thank you, Gail. So I would like to begin by inviting Imelda McCarthy over from Dublin at the moment. And Imelda, for those of you who don't know, is a systemic therapist, supervisor and community grandmother, including my own. Her pioneering training and writing have promoted critical thinking around poverty, inequality, and culturally situated practice. So, Imelda, would you like to come along? Can you unmute Imelda?
Yeah. There we go.
Thank you, Naz, and thank you, Gail, for that incredible reciting. It never ceases to move me when I read it. It just hits the depths of my being, so thank you very much for that. Like Gail, I'm going to read, and I beg you to bear with me because there's ways that I want to say things, and I know if I just speak them naturally, I won't say them in the way that I want to say them. And being in the shadow, I'd say, of a great wordsmith, that wouldn't do. So I want to say two things at the outset. One is that I loved this book. As I read through it, I was enlivened at every level. I loved the ethical stance on which it is based. I loved the aesthetics of how it was written, the invitations to enter the text and mind of the author, and to savor the beauty of the words and poems, to feel in a very visceral way the wild impatience of the author and where it is pointing us towards. Secondly, I want to say that I'm reminded of my dear and very old friend and great woman pioneer of family therapy, Lynn Hoffman. She was a wonderful penwoman and web weaver of our field's potential. Gail Simon follows this path, but in her own unique way. She too is a wonderful penwoman and a weaver of possibility webs through the pink practice set up with Gwyn Whitfield, her writing, her teaching, her cafes, the winter, spring and summer schools, the setting up of Everything is Connected Press to bring out reasonably priced work, and of course, Murmurations, the Journal of Transformative Systemic Practice with Liz Day and Brigitte Pedersen. All these activities and initiations are invitations towards that community building that Gail talked about within our field, and where we can come together to share our wisdoms. For both these gifts, I want to say a big thank you, Gail. And now to the book in hand. The very first paragraph of this book throws down the gauntlet and sets the path for the work and also for the life of the author. It is suggested to us rather strongly that we not be captivated by a method of crowd control. I love that. And by that she means theory and philosophy. Gail suggests that the danger in all of our therapy is that our lens is too narrow, our focus is too small, our frame even smaller when we only focus on the individual, a single couple or family, or a specific workplace, without an appreciation and understanding of the context in which they are formed or deformed, as the case may be. Straight away, we are reminded that we as therapists are also shaped by our contexts and can either continue to be part of the problem or part of solutions as yet unknown. For the latter, we need to be aware of our own reflexive or recursive positioning within conversations and dialogues with those who are asking for our help. We are reminded constantly that we cannot subvert or undermine dominant life and social discourses if we have not deconstructed them for ourselves first. One of the central vantage points for Gail was her outside witnessing of groups she lived within and on the margins of as she grew up. And she talked a little bit about that in her poem. As a Jewish lesbian woman with an abundance of creativity and resistance to all manner of exclusionary practices, she has never lost faith with all of those who find themselves marginalized for whatever reason in our societies. None of us will get it right all of the time, but the intention to be and to act inclusively is always there with Gail. The book brings us through her own professional and personal journey of learning, graduating, teaching, mentoring, writing, and publishing. So the book is not only about systemic practice and research, it is about how these are lived by the author and with those she is in conversation with, friends, colleagues, students, and readers. The book brings us into the author's mind as she contemplates the dilemmas of a practice that constantly pushes boundaries, her own and others. And do I know that well? She does this through contemplations, performances with clients, through poetry, and through her very special presence. So for me, this book constitutes what I would call a living word, rather than something that's in the past tense, as it both tracks a life's work in the past and present, together with pointing to future possibilities. This is because, for me, we're invited constantly into the author's story, poetry, reflections, and ruminations, so that an ongoing conversation with ourselves and the work also becomes possible. And this, for me, is one of the very unique features of this book. As I wandered through the pages of Incitement to Riot, chapter 1, I was once again caught in the excitement of my own early days of weaving the threads of philosophies, methodologies, and skill possibilities into a fabric that might be a useful mat for clients and I to stand on as we surveyed not only the local systems of our lives, but also the socio-political landscapes that we occupied as client and therapist, student and teacher. These were the days of Michael White's outsider witnessing groups, Gail's own hypothetical audiences, Carl Tom's internalized and externalized others, Arlene Healy's talks about talks in a Northern Ireland context, Tom Anderson's reflecting teams, Harry Gulishian and Harleen Anderson's human systems as linguistic systems, the Milan's team's systemic hypothesizing and analysis, and Fifth Province diamonds, and so on. This chapter also shows us how to consider using these ideas in order to leap beyond the pathologized or individualized inner and outer conversations of clients and indeed ourselves as therapists and teachers. A subject close to my own heart is the constant reminder of the possibility for therapeutic abuse at one extreme, and system stasis at the other. Both are likely possibilities when we do not interrogate our own reflexive position in relation to the socio-political sightings of our workplaces. Fancy ideas are no substitute for how the rubber hits the road. And yet, fancy ideas keep us going and energize us in search of useful practices. Continuing with the theme of incitement, we are next met with the invitation to be transgressive. Will it ever stop, I say? However, I would also say that a therapy that is not transgressive is no therapy, merely some kind of social control or status quo maintenance. Following Bateson, perhaps we need to be asking or saying, we cannot not transgress in socially aware therapeutic conversations. This does not mean that we are converting clients or subjecting them to re-education practices in regard to their politics. It means that any deconstruction of individualized pathologizing discourses is transgressive. It is, as Gail stated, merely about breaking new ground. We transgress at the level of undermining the espousal of norms, of deficient identities, and unsettling both the inner and outer discourses of how we don't measure up for someone else, or by some modernist standards of fitting in, regardless of the shoes we are expected to stand in, or the beds we are expected to lie in. What may impede this inciting and transgressive impulse may be the way in which we self-supervise and or practice self-surveillance in saying nothing that goes against the grain. However, that's not to say that sometimes we do need to self-supervise, especially in unsafe contexts and for pragmatic reasons, as anyone in the margins well knows. I remember the Canadian therapist Alan Wade telling a story whereby as the king passed, the peasant bowed low in submission and made a loud fart. So in our inner world and with like-minded colleagues, we need to continue to fart and be positively delinquent in the presence of dominant theories, policies, and practices that do not serve us, our students, our supervisees, and our clients. I love the idea of positive delinquency, being a bit of a delinquent myself since early childhood. And then we're invited into silence. And the numerous ways in which silence is dialogical, relational, and I would say systemic. In silence, we transgress many dogmas about how to communicate well. It's a messy and often highly transgressive, particularly within health industrial terms. It can get us labelled as resistant, defensive, and of course, deficient and perhaps a waste of time, as Gail says. Now, anyone who has meditated with another in silence will know that the relationship space they occupy together co-creates a field-like space, which is often filled with other intuitive knowledges. Gutterances, another term I loved from this book. We pick each other up in the space and a different connection with other kinds of transformational possibilities can emerge. If you doubt this, join a silent meditation group. Even on Zoom or Skype, it also works. And if you're interested, you can always contact me. Finally, this brings us to another kind of outer silent activity in part 1. Thinking and thinking systems. Here in this chapter, many of the activities outlined to date are brought together in a kind of ecology of mind. One of the wise women in my life, Gwyn Whitfield, states that all new knowledge comes from those on the margins rather than from within institutional or institutionalized knowledge and resources. Marginal illuminations can incite us to riot, transgress many norms, and excite creative juices. Thinking systems in all of its meanings bring forth ideas of relational curiosity and seeing beyond socially prescribed and proscribed norms, seeing anew in or into the margins. In this chapter, autism and Asperger's are also offered as portals to expanding our repertoires for systemic curiosity further. Gail refers to families in which there is a differently abled child as being knowledge innovators for professionals, and indeed the wider community, rather than a family to be downsized into a diagnostic categorization exercise. My friend Uma's son, Ronnie Gummersall, identifies as autistic and describes himself as neurodivergent. He says it's not about disease or disability, it's about difference. And like in this last chapter in part 1, he invites his viewers and listeners into possible conversational pathways and cautions about those that are not useful in co-creating mutually rewarding relationships. As I said, this is a powerful book of insights, systemic contemplations and practices for an open, inclusive, compassionate, and ethical way of being and doing. And indeed, not only in therapeutic conversations, but indeed in all of our conversations within our everyday living. Thank you, Gail, for this wonderful book, which recalls our pasts, immerses us in our presence, and points us towards our possible future. I wish you and the book well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imelda. I would ask, Gail, is there anything that you'd like to say in response to what Imelda's just said?
Crumbs. That was,
you wrote the book. Like, this is your fault.
Thank you. That was really. I've got to look up another word for humbling. Really, otherwise it's going to just sound not very humble. But that was lovely. Thank you. I wanted to just add that something that I didn't know, that wasn't in the public domain when I wrote the chapter on autism, and certainly not when I was doing my master's research into what was then called Asperger syndrome, is that Hans Asperger, many of you might now know this, was actually not simply, or not at all, I don't know, some compassionate man who gave a name to a syndrome, but he was colluding with the Gestapo in passing on information about whose lives were considered worth living. Mm. And that is, we have to remember that the whole subject of autism came about in a certain era when a lot of ideas and theories about eugenics and normal and healthy were coming into being. So it's very interesting to think about the terms we use at certain times and how they age with new knowledge. I was thinking about stuff I wrote about working with a family where somebody has Asperger's syndrome. That just feels very uncomfortable to me right now. Also, even the mention of white women as slaves in the piece I read a moment ago. The white slave trade was a thing. It was a nameable thing. Now it feels like an ignoring of the majority of people who have been trafficked, enslaved, so that who are black, and the white perpetrators of that abuse. So there's sort of something about the language at certain times that grounds us in an era, in a culture, in a very particular punctuation, that we have to look back on and think, maybe I'd word that differently now, given what I know now, given what's foregrounded now. Just some responses, but thank you.
Thank you.
I love having you in my life, Imelda, and thank you for all the mentoring you've given me over the years. Mm.
I have a curiosity about something that you guys have both mentioned, and I think it was it Gwyn Whitfield that kind of talked about this kind of knowledge comes from marginalised groups. My question is around, how do you know, or how do you privilege certain marginalised groups over others? So if we look at what's going on right now, there's so many issues. How do you know which ones to kind of focus on, or which ones kind of are worthy of the most attention, or do you divide it equally? How would you do that? So if we look at what's going on in the world, there's kind of climate change, there's Black Lives Matter, there's political things going on across the globe, there's kind of oppression of minorities in other countries, there's genocide occurring in China at the moment. So how do you know which ones, or which marginalized voices are the ones to be foregrounded, and which ones almost need to, it sounds like almost waiting their turn, but not having to wait their turn? How do you negotiate that? Either of you?
The question of our time, Naz. Absolutely the question of our time. And back to Lynn Hoffman's, what was it called? The Art of Lenses. The importance of understanding the lenses that we're using to filter in and out, that we're looking out from very specific culturally situated ways of knowing. So how do we work with those lenses to take into account and see other people's experience, to make connections? For me, one of the uses of what we did in the Pink Practice, what we do in the Pink Practice as a queer counselling practice, is to use it as a springboard to make connections with the oppression of other people, rather than just keep everybody in silos, as though that's possible. But it's a great question. It's absolutely one to dwell with. That I don't consider that a conclusive response on my part.
No. Imelda, is there anything that you want to add to that?
Well, I was thinking that your question was hitting a lot of very important levels. And just in the simple kind of sense of a clinical situation, I would think anything is in the margins if it's not within my within my known world. So I would see anything where I see difference, that I would try and attempt to treat it tenderly, to be humble to what I won't know about the lives of the person in that situation. And sometimes it's easy to know that, you know, we're seeing clients who are in the margins because they are marginalized people, and we know they come from marginalized communities. So you know, I think it's a very complex question, and I think it's a very good question to keep asking. So,
brilliant. I think it just reminds me of a conversation I had a lot of years ago with Gail about these kind of, well, what do I believe in? And I made the grand statement. I was very young and naive and made the grand statement of, I'm against all oppression. And then when you kind of explore what oppression you're against, I think you have to fluctuate in your positionality. I think you should always take a position, and I think it's almost Foucauldian in we have a responsibility to take a position but not be fixed in that position, because ethically that will change. And I think your ethics are tested not when you take a position, but when someone's in, you have to work with somebody who's not in the same position as you. And I think both the kind of clinical practice that I've understood from yourself and Gail, and also in the book, it beautifully kind of negotiates the changing of lenses. So I think that's something that's kind of to think about in regards to some of the comments that you guys have made today. But thank you both. So I think as a timekeeper, I'm going to swiftly move on. And I would next like to invite Jude, who is a systemic therapist, trainer, research tutor and supervisor based in London. And she's published on the kind of subjects around Afrofuturism, systemic reflexivity, and also non-violent resistance, which I'm personally very fascinated by. So Julia, would you like to come forward?
Yes, part of me doesn't want to come forward. Imelda, what a tour you gave. Yes, So what I'd like to do is really just share my connection with Gail's book. Okay, can everyone hear me? Because my system tends to be pretty rubbish. So can you hear me? Yeah? Okay.
Julie, you heard and seen.
Oh, fine, okay. I sat facing the greenery of my garden, the breeze of the day mixing with the fresh smell of coffee, with my laptop, my notebook, alongside my favourite pen. I started the slow read. As I read, things were happening in my mind. I remember wanting to train as a family therapist because it took a different position to the ideas that the problem is located in the individual, and argued that the problem needs to be looked at within the family and wider systems. That resonated with me. At the time of my training, many in the Black community were entering the mental health system. Many never returned back to self. The Black community knew that the issues was not just within the family, but within the wider system too. The systemic community went even further and explored the impact of different contexts. The narrative that we have about ourselves and others, the stories that liberates us and the stories that oppress us. We learned that we were all connected, that the world that we live in was not a chocolate box of surprises, and that our immediate surrounding reflects pretty much familiar stories around the globe. That power hardly moves, and when it does, it's hard to see. But more importantly, that the colour of power is white. As I went on my systemic journey, I found that I wanted more. I wanted more from the approach, more from myself. I was tired of the same menu on the table. But unlike Gail, I was waiting for someone to bring alternative strokes and ideas onto my systemic canvas. But I soon realised that if we have to build our own systemic home. To do this requires leaving home, taking the plunge and going out to sea. Not always knowing what directions to take. It's called getting lost. This journey out to sea is never straightforward. It requires the courage of apprenticeship. It's daring to swim out alone, daring to swim differently. Getting lost is about being able to stand alone. It's about sometimes being unpopular. It's about finding ways of making our difference our strength. Getting lost requires paying attention so you know how to return from whence you came. Indigenous people have a way of going off trail. It's an art. They attend to their surroundings, noting landmarks along the way, attend to the weather, reading the sun, moon, stars to orientate self. It's the text and language of nature. It's the art of being at home in the unknown. I looked up from reading Incitement to Riot, scanning my garden. I realised that I had been lost not so long ago, and found myself closed off to other ideas and ways of knowing, having spent many seasons and years indoors. I thought of the ideas I loved in systemic thinking and those I wanted to expand upon: Indigenous, intersectionality, and critical works of Black scholars, works that had been buried under the belly of academia. Indigenous ideas and ways of thinking led me to enter that space of getting lost. But getting lost was not an experience to be feared. Getting lost was about going into Indigenous terrain, which allowed me to become a historical being. There was a need to remember so that I could talk with authenticity with the young Black men, women, diverse families and communities I engaged with. There was a need for my practice, approach and research to create different contact zones. There was a need to do away with passing encounters. There was a need for creating meeting spaces. A need to know that the answer does not always lie in sense making, and that it sometimes resides in structural deprivation, reinforced by policies that give nothing back. Each chapter of Gail's book is a swim out to sea. Each swim is a return home with new ideas. Each chapter is a meeting ground where ideas are challenged, turned over, knots are tied and untied, questions are asked. This book is an invitation to move, but be warned. Your peers may think that your thoughts are wild and perhaps incoherent, but no learning can avoid that swim out to sea. 2020 is closing down on us. Autumn will bring its carnival of colour. As the American election wades in, Brexit will come out with the tides. Pandemic threatens a return. These events will impact on the marginalised, the forgotten communities and individuals. There's a need for systemic ideas, practice and research to find ways of bringing attention to issues that matter. So depart, go out, become many. Allow yourself to be exposed to new ideas and swim out to sea. Or take your walking shoes and walk out to new surroundings. Get on your bikes, scooters, go off trail in pursuit of something new and see what happens. Let Gail be your North Star to guide you on your way.
Julia, thank you. That was absolutely beautiful. I just wanted to add, I forgot to mention at the beginning that Julia actually did the foreword for the book. So there was something really powerful about what you said about the colour of power being white. And for that, systemic knowledge is then created with that same whiteness. How have you kind of overcome that either theoretically or in practice in that? I think decolonizing academia is a big thing at the moment, and I keep coming across literature of how to decolonize and how to decolonize practice. But how have you personally experienced that while you're simultaneously going through the same kind of process yourself, while helping and supporting others that are going through the same process?
I think the idea that of decolonisation and indigenous ways of knowing and holding on to appreciating marginalised knowledge, and each of us, I think, taking the responsibility to move that forward. So actually, I don't know, modelling different ideas, taking on different ideas. One of the things that I was involved with last year with students was really standing along with them, because they wanted the institution that I was working with to actually take on seriously the whole philosophy of decolonisation and bringing on alternative resources that just didn't stem from one academic thought. And I think we, as a systemic community, need to be much more engaged in alternative knowledge.
Mm-hmm. And I would totally agree. And I think it starts not, and it's that kind of cycle between research and practice. I remember doing my own research and kind of coming to the conclusion and went, oh God, I've only got dead white men in my research. That was the only reference I had. And then I had to go back and go, if I'm talking about these things, how am I not referencing and referring to the knowledge? And that's when I came onto that intersectional journey myself. So I do think it's very powerful. And I do think it's not just the responsibility of a particular group to fight for a particular cause. I agree. I think it's everyone's cause and everyone needs to be involved with that. Absolutely. So thank you. Would any of the speakers or Gail like to respond, or if there's any comments for Julia before we move on?
I'd like to say, Julia, I thank you for all of that. It was very lovely, very generous words, and really important connections with other parts of the different parts of the worlds we inhabit. It makes me think about, one, how I really love and enjoy our theoretical and philosophical adventures, some of which have been geographical in terms of needing to go beyond the systemic community into the radical field of qualitative inquiry, whether it's the European Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, which you've been at since its inception, or even the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry in Illinois. Some really interesting ideas happening elsewhere to bring into the systemic field. Well, also from the field of social construction, we'll hear about that in a moment. But yeah, there was something else I wanted to say, but I really enjoy that. I love what you're bringing into your writing and into the field.
Brilliant. So next, I would like to invite my personal academic crush, and I have been kind of in love with her work for a number of years, Imelda Middleton, who is a queer systemic therapist and supervisor and trainer at the PIC practice in London. She's been developing theories around the practice of ethical and inclusive systemic therapy and training for working with LGBTQI communities. So Amanda, would you like to come to the forward and unmute yourself?
Hey. Hi, Naz. Hi, mutual crushing. We need to keep that off the Zoom. But thank you, and thank you for, and thanks to Gail for inviting me to talk today. I don't know how many people have had a chance to get a hold of the actual book yet, but I think there's something incredibly visceral about when you receive something like this in the post and what it does in terms of affirming our practice. But I think as well, there's, for me, I'm going to talk about the cover, but I'm also going to read, and I'm noticing that we're all reading, and I connect this to perhaps Gail saying to more than one person persistently, oh, you must write. You must write. You must, please, if you could just write that. Are you writing that down? And that this persistent request seems to have paid off, I'd say, in this book launch, Gail. So thank you. So I'm talking about the cover, and I'm saying it's the boots I noticed first. It mostly always is. Beyond my slight overzealousness for shoes is a deep love for what a good pair of boots on a woman represents. Beyond misogynist jokes about women in comfortable shoes, I see sturdiness, I see the capacity for easy movement, I see Dyke, I see kindred. I see the politics embodied of a life lived in a flat sole with good ankle support. I see an unconventional woman, as Gail describes herself. And so as I notice these boots and hold a wild impatience firmly in my grip, just as Gail states, I feel the value of being able to identify the existence of others like myself. These boots on this cover are a symbol of connection for me, a language of sorts, a telling of a queerness. They connect Gail to me via communities of LGBTQI people that have chosen to stand firmly, often in a hiking boot or a Dr. Martin, in the face of so much misreading, misunderstanding, and ultimately mistreatment. I wonder whatever happened to these boots. How many pairs has Gail had since these 1992 editions that grace our cover? What might Gail's boots say about her wanderings, her lying down on hills, her traipsing over stiles, and her strange stillness in the presence of lichen? What wisdom might they add to this book if they had a chapter of their very own? Boots can be thought of as a precursor to cars, a transport of sorts. Boots is to movement, is to travel, is to journey. And though I will talk about boots for just about long enough for it to be uncomfortable or even inappropriate at a book launch, I hesitate to talk about journey. Such an overused metaphor, linear and dull. Recently, I find myself, as I have done for most weeks now for some time, talking with a client about being trans. They are troubled by the journey metaphor. I often spend a lot of time looking at my clients' shoes. The idea that moving from one place to another counts when it comes to a narrative of gender, that getting there, wherever that is, matters, that gender has somehow become a destination, somewhere we save up to arrive at, that people might understand them as having journeyed from one gender to another, burns like nettles on the skin. The crassness of the before and after image, the rage felt at a gender system that categorizes rather than stays curious and allows. There is an often repeated wisdom that transition is a journey, that changes in your social, legal, emotional, and medical genders can somehow be contained by the neatness of transport, like a pair of boots and a good walk. The journey from before to after feels too restrictive and dissatisfying for this person sitting in front of me. And I am so relieved that we're finding a way to talk about something that makes more sense to them, even if we haven't quite found the words for it yet. I am relieved that we are making our way to something that makes more sense to me. And then suddenly I get worried. Did I let out a gutterance? A gutterance refers to the inner movements which precede, accompany, and follow any outer talk. It's activated by the narratives living within the body, which control whether talk stays inner and makes it to outer talk. Guttural responses from the bodies of conversational participants or witnesses to conversations make themselves heard more recognizable in inner dialogue kicks in and before any outer utterance. This is described by Gail in chapter 5, Beyond the Spoken Word. Living a queer life in the good company of many dandies, nonconformists, and gender rebels has enabled me to widen out stories of gender, of womanness, manness, and transness. I'm always carefully excited, but oddly, perhaps even professionally, tentative to see how these stories and experiences of mine and the folks around me crisscross the lives lived and gender wonderings of my clients. Today's client and I embark on a conversation about which metaphors might work better for understanding gender and change and bodies. What image, myth, or legend might echo the experience of bumping up against a cis-normative, heteronormative, white supremacist patriarchy that wants to reduce all of this churning, breathy, heart-thumping wondering about who they are to a reductionist linear journey from one category to another. From man to woman, woman to man, with little reference to the gooey delights and sticky mess that gender is. I, like this client, want metaphors that circle back, that queer and disrupt our possibilities for being, becoming. Somehow we end up talking about the universe. Perhaps it's a better metaphor of our time. How has your gender shaped and changed the way the universe works? I asked. If gender was a planet, what would the other planets think of it? Drawing on the hypothetical audience questions in Incitement to Riot, Chapter 2, which have become a firm friend of my practice, we end up talking about how you might introduce yourself at something like a trans support group, how we might introduce ourselves in ways that don't replicate the, so what are your pronouns and where are you on the gender journey? These normative, linear, usual ways of introducing ourselves and our gender experience often occur in places and seem to terrify many trans folks, including my client. We work together to create more satisfying ways to begin, more satisfying ways to explain. If this group was being live beamed to another support group in another part of the world, what about your gender now, rather than where it's going or might end up, do you think would be most useful or exciting for them to hear about? How do you think people in trans support groups introduced themselves before surgery became such a focus point for trans experience? Or if they are from places far from the clutches of the Western medical industrial complex, how would they talk about trans experience to get to know each other outside of that system? If there was a group specifically for trans people who reject the before and after narrative of transness, how might they reference time and gendered experience? Before I met Gail, I kept the paper Incitement to Riot printed out in an especially precious file where I kept all the papers I could find on doing systemic therapy in a queer way with queer people. It's important to note that everything I could find that made my mind race with the possibility of a queer relational ethic in the way that Incitement to Riot did then and still does now fit into just one lever arch binder, just one. The contribution offered to queer therapists in A Wild Impatience is like a radical field-shaping hug. I was struck in reading this book that it starts and ends with a call. The final chapter on transmaterial worlding is an invitation stronger than any other I've read from Gail to act and think and do and become beyond the individual and the false division created by thinking of relationships as interaction. It provides a step-by-step guide to abandoning the neoliberal humanist project that has occupied so much of our therapeutic endeavour. It calls us to know ourselves better systemically as the systems that we are and experience through the world, to know ourselves as interconnectedness. And for this, I am very grateful. Thank you, Gail, for helping me to stand a little steadier in my boots too.
Amanda, thank you. That was so wonderful. And because I'm just in academic awe of you, I don't necessarily have a question, but I do have a connection. There's something I've heard from what Imelda said, from what Julia said, and from what you've said, is that there's something so powerful about, we always use this kind of word diversity, and we always need diversity in things, but I think it's more powerful to say representation. There's something about seeing yourself in something that makes it so profoundly powerful, because I always see diversity as something that's kind of like salt and pepper on chips. It's not the actual meat of something. And there's something about the existence of this book almost in some ways transcends the words and the concepts within it. I think just the existence of this book is such a powerful idea in itself, because this book wouldn't have been possible let's say 100 years ago for definite, maybe even 50 years ago, it would not have been possible to be written in this way by this woman at this time. There's something about that power and this kind of call that Gail always has to everyone to write things down. I think we do have a responsibility. I think we have a responsibility when we come from groups to write things down and to kind of promote these ideas, and that's why they filter through into our work.
Mm-hmm. I think diversity is that kind of who's in the room, but what are they doing, and what does that mean, and how do we talk in a way that includes all the richness and all the voices. And I think that's what Gail does in the book more than I've found any other reader, is make me feel like I'm really present and everything I've got going on is important, but also bringing in other knowledges and other people who think in completely different ways to me, which, you know, can be a struggle for me. Gail has a way of enveloping all of that together with a very radical possibility. And I think that's for me that kind of radical hug that the book feels like.
And I definitely would agree. And it's not just, there's something quite, when we talk about practice and research, and research and practice, they almost kind of feed into each other, but not simultaneously. And there's something beautiful about this book, which is so live and applicable to actual practice, whilst still so relevant in the same way to research as well. There's something problematic that we're facing in research and in practice, and I think this book challenges and gives us space in order to challenge both. So I would totally agree with you on that one.
And I think we're getting to the point where research and practice are becoming a bit of a tedious binary, in the way that because they are, you know, it's the interconnectedness, they are one, is what I think the book comes to. And for me, that's been around for a while in relation to personal and professional. That's always felt like a very kind of dull reading of use of self, of the politics of therapy, of the kind of the radical possibilities of talking with someone in a life-changing way. So I think that's what it brings me to, is how they like intersperse, interweave, and it's almost gets kind of sea creaturey, globulary, kind of beautifully between research and practice for me.
Brilliant. It's true. So before I just kind of take over with you and myself talking, I'd like to open it up to the rest of the speakers. Is there anyone else that would like to respond to Amanda? Gail?
I love the expression gooey delight when thinking about gender, because I think gender's often, you know, it's become a kind of clinical focus now, where people, in order to discuss gender or change their gender, they've got to present difficulty, struggle. And we know that a lot of that's about society and resources and narratives. And to reframe gender as something to be celebrated, to appreciate as something absolutely gooey, meaning not fixed, not static, not solid, is a very important reframe. I think you've been doing such important work in your training work, Amanda, and your therapy work, and teaching work with around gender. If any of you haven't been on any trainings with Amanda, do find out how to do that. They're very good trainings, because they're not the how-to stuff. They're not, you know, how to spot how to work with It's not thingifying people. It's a very good use of systemic social constructionist ways of seeing, being, doing, becoming. Thank you for your fascinating remarks. I'm intrigued by the punctuation of the boots. I love that, actually. I love that. I grew up in the era of a theatre company. Were they called Sensible Footwear? In North London. I remember seeing them at the Drill Hall a couple of times in Janey Street, when I don't know if it still exists, but it's yeah, I connect with that. Thank you for that punctuation and the rest, and a lovely segue into what Sheila also is going to be having in mind, I'm sure, in terms of that strange binary between practice and research. So.
Thank you. Thank you for the boots.
Which now beautifully leads me on to Sheila McNamee. who was originally trained as a social worker and a family therapist, but is best known for her pioneering writing on social construction in practice and research. And she's a professor of communication at the University of New Hampshire and the vice president of TOAS Institute. And she joins us currently from, are you in New Hampshire, Sheila? Would you like to come forward?
I am.
Sheila, you're on mute.
Now, okay?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Yes, I am in Durham, New Hampshire in the US. And just one correction, I was not trained as a social worker. My training is in communication, but I was trained as a family therapist after that.
Sorry, my mistake.
Oh, Gail, you're allowed to make a mistake. So I did not follow Gail's wise words of writing it down, and I did not write down what I want to say. I mean, I have words written, but not something. But I just want to say, Imelda, Julia, Amanda, what beautiful, beautiful commentary you made, and so important, and really capturing the spirit of Gail's book and the message that she's, trying to send to us and or share with us, I should say. So I wanted to also speak about the cover art because I feel this other connection with Gail, not only around these ideas and our collaborations and our friendship, but also in that we have made messes in painting together in various places. Well, I guess only in my yard here. And so we both kind of nag each other to get back to the art and do some art. So I love the fact that she picked a piece of art that she had done herself many years ago as her book cover. And it's inspired me to think I better do some good art. So if I have a book, I could use it. But right now I wouldn't have anything I'd want to share. So I refer to myself as a social constructionist, and I was trained as a systemic therapist as well. So the term systemic constructionist work fits for me. But what I really see this work as, and it is the theme here, is a form of social activism. And just a personal aside, I feel so enormously privileged to have the profession that I have, to where my job is to share these ideas with young people and hopefully change the way they look at the world from a world of binaries, a world of rights and wrongs and true and false and the haves and the have-nots, to really embrace the complexity that we live among and be able to approach and deal with that complexity in innovative ways. And I think, Gail's book has I just love the voice in the book. And I think if we look historically at the writings around constructionist work, systemic work, we see in the early years a very kind of academic presentation of these ideas, very conceptual, very theoretical. And over time, we have really been able to write in a way that is the message that we want to give. And what I mean by that is write in a way that is inviting and challenging and deconstructing and inviting the kind of curiosity that we want. And I think Gail does this beautifully in her writing. The book is such an important piece of work. The theme you were right, Gail, what I want to talk about is sort of the blurring of the boundaries in a lot of ways. I mean, for me, the blur of the boundary between practice and research is the biggest blur that needs to happen. And I don't see these as separate practices. I'll tell a story. When I was doing my PhD, I was taking courses in the family therapy department, and of course, writing my dissertation in the communication department, and I was sort of back and forth and back and forth, and mirroring basically all of my life, never knowing exactly where I belonged, and feeling very much in the liminal space between the two. And also imagining that these two groups couldn't connect with one another. So, if I were to host a party, I wouldn't be able to invite them all because it just wouldn't work. And what I learned from that experience was that is the most privileged place to be, in that liminal space, because the resources and the tools that you garner in one, so the language, the ways of working in the family therapy work that I was doing, when brought into the communication work, added a whole different way of looking at what we were talking about, the ways in which we talked about it, and vice versa. Okay. However, that liminal space is a really challenging space to operate in, which I think everybody here would agree. Again, in my own, marching through academia, when it came time for me to be evaluated for tenure to see if, I would be able to keep my job for life, which I'm very privileged to be able to do. I was appalled when my committee decided that they needed to split the people who would be reviewing me, these outside reviewers, between what they referred to as practitioners and scholars. And I had a lot to say to them about that in my work, in my view, practitioners are scholars and scholars are practitioners. And if the two are not one and the same, they shouldn't be doing what they're doing, because these binaries are just not helpful to us. So the same sort of blurring of the boundary between writing and speaking that Gail takes up in the book, and between talk and silence, between dominant culture and marginalized communities, between politics and practice. I mean, again, back to what I said in the beginning, this is a form of social activism. And we have to recognize that everyone who is in a position of, whether it's as a scholar, an academic or a therapist or anything else, we are engaged in political activity. We are engaged in processes of creating a future and opening some possibilities and closing down others. And those are political acts. So I think I've learned a lot from my life in these liminal spaces. And the things that I see echoing in what Gail is writing about is this persistent curiosity rather than judgmental. We don't hear something new and immediately evaluate or judge, but become curious to understand it in its own terms. And that's an issue that I think people have a hard time with, because they think the goal is always to come to an agreement, and it's not. The goal is to understand differently. That doesn't mean or suggest that we have to agree. Also, the centrality of self-reflexivity, of just being able to continually question our own positions and be in that inner dialogue, and let that inner dialogue, kind of make its way out into the outer dialogue. The importance of coordinating multiplicity rather than trying to unify into what is the right way to go. That all situations are unique and different, and we need to find a way to live with the complexity, particularly in today's world. And connecting, for me, this is more a message to myself, connecting academic life with political life, that those connections are so incredibly important. And all of this demands an intense level of vulnerability. And I think once we step into that space of vulnerability, this voice comes out, this voice of speaking indigenously, speaking from our experience and our curiosity and our are questions about why our experience has been this way, rather than speaking from a voice of authority, assessment, judgment, etc. So the issues Gail raises in the book invite the reader to take seriously their life narratives. That becomes a starting point, and certainly in what she's offered, it's beautiful because you really see and hear and learn about roads she's traveled and relationships she's engaged in. And I think that that's an important lesson for all of us to write from that visceral experience that we have, because that's where our ideas begin, that's where they come from. And not to dismiss that in favor of some kind of abstraction, to really get down to the bone, so to speak. So I think the message here is for us to move onward, particularly in this time of global unrest and isolation. The more we continue in our traditional ways of operating, the more we isolate, the worse things become. So blurring the boundaries, and very important, don't neglect to contribute and have the significance of the material world in shaping our ways of being. I mean, that last chapter, I agree on transmaterial worlding. That voice has been very late to come to these ideas, and yet it's so critically important, because it is not just the ways in which we engage with each other that is significant in creating the world we live in, but it's the way we engage with our environment, with the material world, and all aspects of it. So thank you, Gail, for the opportunity to say a few unwritten words about this book. And thank you. I mean, as others have said, I was so excited when I received the book, and I had already read it, but I sat down and started flipping through it again. It's such a delightful and such an important read. I really have to underscore that.
Right. Thank you, Sheila. I think the point that you make, I think, is everything is politics. I think there's a famous quote by, was it Thomas Mann that said that everything is so political, that there is that necessity, there has to be challenge. We have to be able to do politics within our work, within our practice. And I think you've beautifully articulated how to kind of exist within this kind of space. But my question to you is that outside of this kind of space where activism is possible, or where we do our work, exists still the binary on the outside. So how do you respond? How do you respond to the kind of academic elitism of how to write something, or the political elitism of how to practice something, or the institutional elitism? How do you respond while simultaneously coexist, living in this space, being reflexive, doing that practice with yourself? But how do you respond to the external that, regardless of whether we agree or not, still does exist?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. And, I've spent a long time trying to figure ways to do that. So, and the way I operate is, if there's a requirement, from the outside binary world, which of course there always is, I think, okay, I can meet that requirement, but I'll do it in a subversive way that invites, those I'm working with. So, for me, it's education. It's, in a university classroom, and, just as a really simple example, I have to give students grades, students have to get grades, but none of us really think that that's the most useful way for learning to take place. So we make some agreements about what grades mean, that grades are just another way of having our conversation. Like, it's not, you are this kind of a person, it's more, don't you think our conversation could be better about this topic? Don't you think we could engage? And they're just, that's a silly little example, but there are ways, I think that's the way to operate, is to say, we have a couple of options. We could fight against the policies, procedures, the normal way of working, and I think that that's often quite worthwhile. But we also can be more subversive, to say, okay, I can do that, but then you twist it and do it in a way that invites those you're working with into a really collaborative deconstruction of that dominant discourse, and a reconstruction of something that is generative and useful for those people.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'd like to invite the speakers and Gail, if there's any kind of comments or questions or queries for Sheila. Gail, you're muted.
Thank you, Sheila. Yes, I look forward to seeing the cover on your selected papers by you.
I was going to say, I'll take the one that you did that's in my garage and put it in
No, no, that should be chucked. Anyway, thank you for those thoughts. I really think this is one of the biggest challenges. It wasn't that long ago that people were saying therapy isn't connected to politics. And academic teaching should be neutral. That's part of your job, is not to take a position and not to encourage people to take a position, which of course doesn't fit with critical thinking, because we need to encourage our trainees, our students, our colleagues, ourselves, to be aware of the context we're acting out of, the ideology that's at work in how we go about everything. There is no neutral territory anywhere in anything we do. It's all culturally produced, and I guess that's a big part of your contribution, is pointing to that. I think everybody who's spoken today has an investment in pointing to those culturally situated knowledges and deconstructing them to open more space. So thank you very much for making those connections in an ongoing way and tonight. And thank you also for pointing out the need for this other set of connections, which is newer for me in writing terms. And I want to see if we can just find Leah Salter, who is somewhere here. I'm just going to unmute Leah when I can find her. The thing with these pages, people jump around and they're not that easy to find. Leah, can you unmute yourself? Because I can't quite, I've just got sort of phasedness at the moment. But there's something about the work Leah and I have been doing together that is both, are you there, Leah?
I am, I'm here.
Okay. Where's Leah on speaker? Anyway, there's something about, I mean, Leah, you probably, I don't know if you'd put it like this, but for me, the work we've been doing about connecting, about exploring the relationship between humans and the material world, and between humans and humans, that kind of incredible power imbalance that exists, where there's this notion of white male, heterosexual, healthy, tall, blonde, etc., human that's in charge, the superior being in charge of everything. I don't know why, as systemic practitioners, I think people privately hold these ideas that there's a systemic perspective, and that social constructionism is a key to understanding how the world is organizing itself through language, through narratives, and how they transition into structures, physical, political, all kinds of structures. But I think Leah and I are sort of on a roll with some of this stuff at the moment, writing more, presenting more. We've got other projects planned. Leah, did you want to say anything? Because the paper in the book on transmaterial worlding, is it Beyond Human Systems? Is something we co-wrote.
Yeah. So firstly, thanks for the heads up.
Yeah, message saying, come in a minute.
So yeah, I wasn't expecting to speak, but thank you for the invitation. I think, what do I want to say? I think I want to say that the most important thing for me in terms of the process of co-writing with you, Gail, is the collaboration, and how much I'm really struck by how much people today have talked about how you invite people to write, and in your writing is an invitation to see writing as a kind of talk, as a kind of dialogue. And I think that's for me, that process of writing together is how some of those ideas got formed. And I think when we began that process, we didn't really know what we were going to write, and we didn't have a title. You know, words just kind of came together as we progressed in the kind of, you know, email back and forth in, and Zoom in and telephone in and all sorts of things. But it also, I think that the writing that we've been involved in has also come about because of the conversations that we've both been having with people on the course, people on the doctorate, but also the people in the reading seminars that we're part of. You know, it feels like a very collaborative and very generative process, but it's also it's a signal, I guess, that we are highlighting that it's time for change, that it's time for us to consider things that have been sidelined, people that have been sidelined, aspects of our world that have been sidelined for too long. And I think that's all I want to say, Gail, because this is your book launch.
Well, actually, I thought of something else, that if it hadn't been for Sheila, McNamee and Mary Gergen's invitation to us to write
That's true.
chapter in the forthcoming page handbook of social constructionist practice, where to begin with we were going to write quite a, I don't know what, something as, you know, social constructionist inquiry kind of chapter heading, and then something else happened. And something does happen often in the process of writing, especially as I'm discovering when you collaborate with writing, other things happen. You know, Leah's very bothered by a lot of ecological stuff. I like to think I am as well. And so some of the writing has been tortuous in the sense of coming across difficult stories, you know, a world in decline, abuse of peoples, systematic abuse. But at the same time, it's felt very constructive to have, you know, it's lovely to be asked to write things, because then you have to do something once you've said yes.
Yeah.
You've got a deadline, you have to produce. Somehow we created the space which was there anyway in the systemic community, to follow up on some other systemic avenues, and to use systemic ideas for a world in crisis. And this separation, this determination that Sheila was talking about, to fight those distinctions, and that Amanda was also talking about, to just resist the binaries, is so important. And it's, as systemic social constructionists, we're set up to do that, and we have to be much less nice. People are probably used to me hearing me say this. We have to be much less nice and kindly listening dialogical types, and start to work out where we need to be articulating and challenging some of these discursive practices that are very oppressive, destructive. So this is a big challenge for all of us. This isn't just Leah and Gail writing something now. This is an invitation to anybody to develop critique, whatever these ideas. Yeah. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Leah, for the co-writing and the co-presenting. We're on tour, by the way.
Could I just say one tiny little thing in addition? I just want to say that writing critique, as you just so articulately said, Gail, is really important now more than ever. But the way that we write, and so that's what I want to kind of elevate in your book, is that there's a way, there's a heavy critique that only invites counter critique, and you go nowhere. And then there's critique where you invite people into almost a slice of life, so they can say, oh, wow, I never saw it that way. You know, that it's a more generative critique than a degenerative critique. And so I just wanted to make that point. I also wanted to say that you are the queen of connection, and everything is connected. Imprinture is a perfect name for you because, as others have already mentioned, you are so good at making things happen and bringing people together that your sense just says these people need to know each other. So thank you.
I think if anyone from the audience does have a question, the chat box is open. So if you want to get typing, what I'm just going to kind of make some comments. I'm going to open it up for the speakers first, and then we can have some chat later. Gail, it's actually a criticism that I've always had about the systemic community, about it being almost too nice. And I feel like the stance of neutrality almost became the death of curiosity. And it was actually speaking to Imelda who reminded me that systemic practice started off as activism. It started off as being radical. That's what the roots of it were. So this idea that I feel that your book is almost in some ways making connections also to the past in being kind of making it explicit again, and it's getting away from this having to be nice or being neutral, and it's getting back to the roots of what systemic practice was actually originally about being critical, about being radical, about being activist. So I think sometimes when you read books, it can almost, what's become mainstream can be seen as, oh my God, this is radical now. And I don't think it is. I think it's almost in some ways a throwback to the original roots of what systemic practice really was. So I'd like to first kind of open it up to the speakers if there's any further comments, and then we can move towards questions from the audience. Okay, I think Imelda?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to Julia. I just loved your recounting of your positioning and your reflections on your life, on your trajectory, your work, your weaving through being a systemic therapist. And then of course, Amanda's, hitting she's such a pragmatic speaker. I just love listening to. I've only heard you twice, Amanda, but I love listening to you speak. And I just love that you took up the metaphor of the boots, because to me, it's like the rubber hitting the road. And I think when you speak, it's always about the rubber hitting the road, the boots hitting the road. You can see where you are in your practice. It's transparent, it's energized, it's passionate, and that all comes across. I loved that. And Sheila's always kind of reflective positioning is so great to hear. And she's got such a soft nature, and I think that comes through in how she responds to people and how she invites people. So it's just brilliant. But going back to what you said there, Naz, about systemic theory and practice started off as a kind of activism, because all of the pioneers had to fight the dominant psychodynamic and psychoanalytic paradigms of the day, and go and create their own ways of working. And sometimes that wasn't that easy. They met with a lot of hostility and ridicule at the time. And often they had to go and kind of practice away in cubby holes, as it were, and not tell people what they were doing until they were ready to come out. And certainly that was the way of our team when we started in the early 80s into that. And I think that whole area that you were talking about there, liminal spaces, it just brings me back to Celtic mythology, Sheila. Because the liminal space in Celtic mythology is when you stand at the edge of water. So you stand at the edge of the ocean, you stand at the edge of a forest, you stand at the portal of somebody's home, or a house of any description. And it has a kind of fairy-like magical quality to it. But it actually is that liminal space that also brings you to the margins, because it connects to all the margins. It connects to the boundaries, as it were. And you don't have to be nice in a liminal space. I mean, if anybody ever saw Shakeen, the wonderful Shakeen practicing curiosity, he could be absolutely and totally outrageous. Now, he was also very lovable. And he got away with it because he stayed on theme with the family or the person. And I remember in our own practices, we had a practice called questioning at the extremes. And people would say, how could you ask such a question? But actually, we never asked the question unless we had been given some kind of permission for it. And that's also about being in liminal space, is that it's a space which is attached and also unattached at the same time. And I have to say, those are the ideas that fed my practice, I think, through my life. And so it's lovely to hear people speaking about them in different guises tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Imelda. Gail, since you can have a view of the chat, I know we've only got about 15, maybe a little bit more time left till the end. Is there anything you'd want to respond to on the chat?
A question to Sheila from Yang Tae. You imply that assessment grades can perpetuate binaries. Would you be able to talk about a personal example where it's possible to navigate this and have a dialogue about grades with your students that circumvents such a predicament? Wow, that's a seminar. Is that an invitation to Sheila to do a seminar on such a subject? Because I think a lot of us who are involved in training would love to attend that and hear Sheila's vast experience on that very matter. Sheila, a response on that? I'm trying to unmute you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't unmute myself. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say, but very briefly, I think if we go back to the basic notion that we create meaning together in what we do, then it really is pragmatically a matter of reconstructing the meaning of a grade. So, you know, nuts and bolts, I have this conversation about, I hate giving grades, you hate getting grades, you know, but we all have to do this thing. So let's think of grades in another way, and then let's mix up the ways in which grades are distributed. So for example, this is really a no-brainer, but you know, if a student has to write a paper, I say this is a way of having a conversation between us. You know, you write the paper, I write all sorts of comments on it. If you don't like the quality of the conversation by virtue of whatever grade it gets, then rewrite it. And then we start over. And then if you don't like that, rewrite it. So basically, I just let people keep doing things until they say, you know, I like the kind of conversation we're having. So there's like a straddling between saying, okay, we have to have grades, so they're there, but they don't mean the same thing. Like, you know, once you get this grade, then you're stuck with this grade. It's, if you really want to, you know, keep talking about this so that you really can show yourself, more than me, but show yourself how much you've learned, then just keep doing stuff. And so that's one little way.
Thank you. There aren't any other questions at the moment. I don't know if people realise that you can type a question in the chat if you have one. You don't have to have one. You can just be doing whatever you're doing. I think I see somebody knitting, which sounds like a really good use of time. But I have a question for Vicky Reynolds, if that's all right. Dear friend and colleague Vicky Reynolds in Vancouver. Vicky, I've been thinking a lot recently about that wonderful expression, the need to be a fluid and imperfect ally. And I've been thinking how there are times when I found myself taking comfort in the word imperfect. And I become intolerant of the leaning towards assuming that I'm going to be imperfect, that I could rest in that space too easily. And I wondered if you had anything else to add to that about it could, yeah, that, in terms of activism, in terms of making a difference.
Yeah, I've been, well, thanks so much for inviting me to I started laughing because like, Gail's going to ask me a question. Leah, you and I know this because Gail's thrown us together too. Just first of all, I'm speaking from Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh territory, what gets called British Columbia, so I need to acknowledge the territories I'm on. This perfectionism is white supremacy in action, right? It's absolutely patriarchy. It's absolutely an enactment for me of settler privilege. You know, this idea that that instead of, you know, here's what activists do, right? We see oppression, we respond in the moment with action. It's going to be imperfect by its very nature, but it's entirely relational. And this whole idea about interconnectedness, right? That this is something that is happening to me. This isn't just happening to a homeless person being harassed by a cop. I am a part of this community. I'm witnessing this. I'm a piece of this. I can't be taken a part of that. That's what I mean by being fluid and imperfect allies. So then I respond in the moment with the best thing I can do. In that situation in my hood, it's always asking the officer, oh man, has someone else attacked Dance? Dance, did someone hurt you or steal your stuff? And immediately situate the homeless person as a victim of crime, which they most often are, and challenge the cop for his performance of power, and then ask him, what's your name, officer? Oh, Officer Fabulous. Then he knows I got his name. They just immediately back off. It's a good tactic, except when it's not, right? And then, you know, then after the response, then you need to check in and say, was that okay with the person? And Dance will say, Vicki, I didn't need that. What is this shit? You keep talking for me. Just back off. I had this shit. And that's a cop I know. Now he's pissed with me. I'm going to pay for that, right? So that, and then I have to make repair. You know what, like Sheila talks about, like this is not linear. This isn't like, there's not steps for this. It's this messiness, this lovely relational process. So the fluidity about that kind of, and allyship, of course, is language that's being contested now as it should be, but it's not that it's never an identity category that I'm acting as an ally. It's like in this moment, what kind of actions required relationally to hold just practice or social justice for all of us, right? I don't know if I've even responded, Gail. I've been so excited to hear Imelda talking about questions at the margins, which set me on fire decades ago. And just, it's been really cool listening to this, but I'm just thinking about, yeah, I also appreciate about, we want to hold attention if we're speaking about having an imperfect practice, you know, that I always talk about all my work as an imperfection project, but that's not a new location, right, Gail, where I'm no longer tense or moved or unsettled. I want to continue to unsettle myself as a white settler. I need to continually unsettle myself so that, yeah, I don't want to create a new binary, as Sheila would say, right, between a perfection project and an anti-perfection project. I want to embrace this mess, right? And my PhD, which Sheila McNamee was a huge part of, and Gail Simon helped me publish from it, you know, like everybody here, Gail's like, you got to write, was about a solidarity approach, the rhizome and messy practice. And that's informed for me by this direct action activism that is never, ever, not only not perfect, but it's never even correct. It's always a mess and requires a redress and a repair and a new learning. So, and that's part of the process. That's not because we don't have it right. That's because we are continually in relationship. Yeah, I'm hoping I said something meaningful there for you, Gail.
Said something, wrote something. Please do a search on Amazon, or sorry, maybe not Amazon, but anywhere you want for Vicki Reynolds' books, Vicki with a V-I-K-K-I, but because they're important reads. Thank you, Vicki. Okay. I would like to say something about niceness. Jude Egan, let's find you, Jude. Can you unmute yourself? Would that be good, Jude Egan, for you to unmute yourself? Is that going to work?
Jude, I've just sent you a request to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
There you go.
Sorry. In my dressing gown. Two things. If anybody's never gone to Amanda's training, go. They're brilliant. It's the one I remember. I've been to so many over many, many years. I'm very old. Hers, I will remember. The second thing about, there is something about niceness that I'm very worried about. Niceness in therapy. And there's a wonderful book, I recommend it to you, Difficult Women by Helen Lewis. And in it, she says, the block to feminism is the tyranny of niceness. And can we all stop being nice and put on our boots?
I love that.
Oh, and thank you. It was the most fabulous discussion. I've been really, really pleased to be part of hearing everybody's views.
I think, Jude, that somewhere in the pile of papers in the room I'm sitting in is a copy of your thesis from KCC. Remind us what it was called.
Well, the first one was a challenge on neutrality, and the second one was a challenge on the issue of power.
Yeah, that's why I've got a copy of it.
But Gail, I absolutely hate writing. I'm very frightened of writing because writing suggests judgments. If you're talking, you can shift, you can move, can't you? You can play with it. Writing, to me, which isn't why I never did a PhD or anything after I qualified, was too scary. Otherwise, I'd have come and do a PhD at Luton.
Writing fixes things, and so in that sense, you become in the reader's eyes the person you were when you wrote that, even if it was 20.
Yeah, as if it's totally fixed. So there's no fluidity, there's no flexibility.
Yeah, but also, you know, we say things to each other and then we think, oi, what did I say? How did I manage to say that?
But you can shift that. But writing, it's a bit like, oh, she said that.
And then you have to write another paper.
Can I just interject for 1 second? As an absolute phobic of writing, and I mean deeply phobic of writing, I've had this conversation and Gail's tried to harass me for years to write, ever since she's met me, and it's been a long, but 12 years.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I always kind of go with the argument of, if thesis was like Plato, just talk. If I could just talk, I'd be fine. I'd have a PhD. I would have 5 by now. If I could just do the Socratic talking and be awarded something. But my point and realization, especially reading this book, was that we would never have known what Socrates said if it wasn't for Plato writing it.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're quite right.
And that was the only revelation that and this is probably one of the most revelations I've had with reading. I've known Gail for a lot of years and I've seen her practice and I've seen her work. And to be kind of in awe of how political it is, how radical it is, how the throwback, I do think I totally commend Gail on her ethic in how to write. But I don't even feel it's just, no offense, Gail, I don't feel it's just Gail's success. I think the book screams to me the voices of the family members of hers that I know, her partner, the conversations that she's had with other people, the reading that she's had, and the other people that she's read. And I think it's a beautiful amalgamation of all these ideas and all these voices that we then accredit to one person, which, Gail, honestly, congratulations on this book, which actually takes us almost a time. But I just want to commend you and absolutely every other voice that is present within this text, because I think it's just been such a beautiful and refreshing work.
I feel a child of the systemic community. I feel a child of KCC, which was a pioneering training, systemic training, ideas community. I feel, so thank you for recognizing my family and the history and my contribution, but I feel like I'm just another community member. And I'm not saying that with any humility. I really believe it. I really mean it. And writings are, Jude, I take your point about how writings, you can't take them back and correcting, but you know, they get forgotten and they get critiqued. And I see all my writings not as sort of biblical tomes that must be respected and fixed and adhered to, but as stepping stones. They're just stepping stones for other people to take what they want from, build on, critique, develop, forget about. There's somebody else that I want to recognize here was part of that pioneering thing, and that's Shoshana Simon. So I'm going to just spotlight her for the moment, and who is a long-standing colleague. We were bad girls together, meaning transgressive. And Shoshana, thank you for being here. Goodness knows what time it is in San Francisco. I've unmuted you, but you know, I loved what you said in that chapter where you worked with, it was the first chapter on working with lesbians that I'd read, and it was working with lesbian couples where one had a lot of internalized homophobia and the other was quite out, and you managed to get the one with a lot of internalized phobia to say to their partner, thank God it's you who's the lesbian in our relationship. And I felt that that was the most inspired, brilliant intervention. And it was that kind of chutzpah that we understood, that kind of Jewish irreverence that I think helped us get through some of those very sticky early times where there was too much reverence theoretically around us in the lesbian therapy community, such as it was in very, very early days. Yeah.
Thank you. And I just saw your little chat to me, and I had responded, but I think I sent it to Naz. I had put in, how is niceness bound up with white dominant Britishness? And I think you're kind of answering that. It's like, how do we claim, and it's like, for what everyone is saying here, this is such a beautiful dialogue. How do you find what's authentic within your own cultural contexts? And for us in that work, we knew where we were coming from. You know, we were reclaiming our own voices at that time within a dominant psychoanalytic framework that was influencing lesbian and gay therapy at the time. And I think it's like, you know, what the role of humor in survival is a through line in my life. It's just what is real, you know. And that's in all of our lives. There's a through line of survival that's connected to our cultures, and maybe niceness that runs through a dominant strand of Britishness has been survival oriented too. But the problem is it becomes a police force. It polices other ways of knowing, and I think that's the danger. But I don't want to discredit it either. Niceness has a history. What's the history? Whose history is it, and how is it affecting other people? So I feel like where you're taking the work and in this dialogue is like that the openness and creativity and the breaking out of like the mold of how we're supposed to talk and bringing more of who we are in. And in my own work, it's been about, I run an expressive arts therapy program, so it's been about expanding from scholar practitioner to actually seeing that the artist is the bridge between the scholar and the practitioner. It's that creative process that needs to be, that I feel needs to be named and brought forward. And I see that's what you're doing in your work, and I can't wait to read this book. Thank you. Thanks for being here, everyone. It's great.
Thanks, Shoshana.
Gail, you're muted. But on that note, it does take us to time. But the book is out now. So please, please do get yourself a copy. If you haven't already, this is the book. Gail, where can people get this?
You can order it from a bookshop. They should order it in, but the quickest way is to order from Everything is Connected Press, or if you're an Amazon purchaser, or maybe some other online place. I don't know. It's around. You can get it from places. Thank you.
And we're perfectly on time. And I'm not sure if that's ever happened with anything we've ever done.
Thank you all so much for coming this evening, for participating. I'm sorry we couldn't have that wonderful systemic dialogical chatter and the kind of hubbub noise that goes on when people are all talking with each other and refuse to be silenced, which happens in systemic gatherings. And a special thank you to Naz for doing what she does well, organising, and chairing and hosting and asking the questions of the moment. And thank you also to my dear colleagues who took the time to be here and speak and present and share their responses. That's just been wonderful for me. And yes, of course, I look forward to some writings and responses. Please be in touch. Very findable on the internet. If there's anything you wanted to say, please be in touch. There's always more to say, always more to do. Let's just keep writing and reading and talking. Thank you. Thank you all, and have a good evening or day wherever you are.